Want from a local guide. There were plenty of old barrows. 2 smaller ones. Vera had even explored in search of grave tar for Lovenar. The Altmer had warned her that the local Nord dead were of the restless variety. The barrows, as far as she could tell, were designed to keep the dearly undeparted from running around the countryside. Keep to the entrance areas, Lovenar had admonished, and do not disturb the armored corpses. Then, there was the process of scraping off grave tar, black resinous gunk used, she guessed, for preserving the mummies, from the places where it accumulated, mostly in the hollows, such as armpits, mouth, and groin area. Not particularly pleasant work. Rabbi brought tea, and Vera leaned back in her chair, warming her hands on the mug cradled between her palms. The Nord was in no hurry to elaborate, probably waiting for her to ask for clarifications. He had moved on from stuffing his stomach to stuffing his pipe. If they were grave robbers, then perhaps this played out in her favor in the end. She would point out the barrels' locations. She could even take them as far as the entrance. And then they could go crawl around in the tunnels to their heart's content, and she'd mind the camp outside. 500 septims, Bothela had said, even if Unnar, the mad and demon chops, didn't make it out, she'd still be left with almost a third of the full bribe. Right. No skin off her back. The itchy feeling at the base of her nape made her glance up. She had drifted off into her thoughts. The Dunmer was watching her with a mixture of amused curiosity and speculation, likely waiting to see how she would react to his employer's semantic gymnastics. So, she took another sip of tea. I take it you're looking for someone to help you loot. Loot? Unnar puffed up like an amorous pigeon. I am no vulgar looter, Snowberry. Doesn't take much skill to do that, no. But first things first. He unclipped the leather purse from his belt and slammed it on the table, narrowly missing his plate. It's all there. It's all there. 150 up front. I am a man of principles, lass. Bringing in a new partner. Ain't shoving coins down a wench's blouse. There are risks involved. We'll do this right. Bira eyed him dubiously. How did Demon Chops put up with this troll? Probably because they were cut from the same less than upstanding cloth, was how. In my experience, shoving coins where they're not wanted is always risky business. Minimally, you'll lose the coins, with nothing to show for it but your bruised pride. The Nord's laughter boomed through the tavern, collecting a few curious glances. Firebrand, aren't you? I like you, Snowberry. Are you saying you don't want the money? I'm saying jingling some coins in my face isn't going to make me take a deal when I don't know what I'm walking into. You still haven't explained what it is that you've misplaced. Fine, Undinar relented. Smart girl. Teldrin, you still have that map? Let's not keep the lady in the dark, Give it a moment, I'll explain. You can count the coins in the meantime. Bira pointedly ignored the satchel in front of her. The drawstring had come loose, and the gold inside caught the firelight. The septims looked exceptionally clean, as if someone had spent time polishing them. Cyril blew smoke out the side of his mouth, pinched his lips over his roll-up to free up his hands, and went rummaging in his pack. He extracted a folded note, crumpled and stained with grease, and passed it to Unnar. Anything else? A perfect melange of derisive and deferent. No matter how much he liked coin, the merc didn't exactly seem to enjoy being ordered around. Bira glanced at the note. In addition to the other damage, it had a very suspicious brown stain along the edge. She hoped it was just dried blood. Either way, she wasn't going to touch that thing with a 10-foot pole. Unner pushed his plate to the side and smoothed out the paper on the table between them. And there you have it. That moment in the old sagas when our fearless adventurers pore over a mysterious map that will lead them to their destiny, he declaimed, a gleeful twinkle in his eyes. Behold, Snowberry, the map. We were hoping you'd start by helping us make sense of it. Bira cocked her head to one side. That didn't help, so she cocked it the other way. Not an improvement. You call that a map? She was genuinely curious. Looks like a map to me, Ciro drawled. What would you call it, Outlander? Vera glanced at the merc. I'd call it a doodle, but I could be swayed into amending it to scribble if you're persuasive. As a map, if that's what it is, it's unusable, though I suppose you could wipe your ass with it in a pinch. Damn it, even in this place, there should be some standards for what passed for cartography. Not to your liking? Something dark flashed under the layer of raspy sarcasm. Vera didn't think his face could do soft even if he tried it. No wonder he'd gone into hiring out his sword arm. He certainly looked the part. Should have asked the fetcher to apply himself, I suppose. He dragged on his rolly, holding the smoke in before blowing it out in a quick hiss. Pity I slit his throat first then. And now, there was an unmistakable warning in his voice, lazy drawl notwithstanding. Vera tensed. Her bow was unstrung. Not that a hunting bow did you much good in a close fight, as she wouldn't reach her dagger in time, not against the Merce. Unnir looked like he'd be slower, master velocity and all that, but the Dunmer was all coiled compact energy. Ciro, you keep trying to intimidate the lass, and I'll dock your pay. Now, Snowberry, before you bring the guards down on us. Unnir patted the diagram. We lifted this off a bandit. Didn't go searching for trouble either. But there we were, walking, just minding our manners, and there they were, and, well, you can imagine the rest. Vera breathed out, forcing the tension to drain from her muscles. Her mind had conjured up a rather different scenario. She took a sip of tea, sloshed the liquid around, focusing on the heat. We're not our history. No, Dima, love, we are our history. Something about what she said had hit a nerve with demon chops, and he had lashed out, or rather, showed his teeth. She filed it away, forcing herself to look at the Dunmer, face open, serious. Nothing wrong with killing bandits. Easy there, asshole. I'm not your enemy. Just stopped commissioning them for drawing you maps, yeah? She got herself a chuckle for that one. Slight surprise, oversized pupils widening, then a shift, his shoulders easing. He took another drag, blew smoke to the rafters, a perfect ring drifting into a distended oval. If you have better candidates in mind, I'm all ears. Point is, lass, we need you to help us decipher this less than satisfactory doodle, as you said. We know it's a map, and we need to get to wherever it's pointing. Unnar had shed his jovial dumbass act. For a moment, he looked almost grave, but then Frabai brought him another ale, and the happy buffoon mask came back on. Vera leaned forward, examining the lines of the drawing. Now that she was focusing on it, the sketch wasn't so nonsensical. But you couldn't draw a map if you kept yourself on the ground. Your mind had to take wing. This wouldn't tell them the distance, just the vantage point of where the doodler had stood. All right. That right here? She tapped the squiggle, vaguely reminiscent of an anvil. Could be the Zenithar shrine, and if so, then that here looks like it's the peak northeast of the island with the old temple. She glanced at Unnar to see if he was following. Crickets. They really didn't know the area. All right then. That dotted line, I'm guessing, means you have to go around it. And this looks like... Her lips went numb. Oh, shit. Unnar's bushy eyebrows lifted in question. What is it, lass? Vera leaned back, crossing her arms over her chest. Not for all the coin in Skyrim. She wasn't. That's Red Eagle Redoubt. This time, the look Unnar gave her wasn't so blank, but he hid it well, washing down the flash of recognition with more ale. Vera turned to the Dunmer, one of the largest forsworn camps this side of Markarth. Demon Chops quirked an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth hitching up. I'll remember to be suitably impressed. Can you take us there, girl? Vera forced her shoulders into a shrug. No. Unnar and Ciro exchanged a look. I'm not going anywhere near that place, but I'll bring you close enough, and then you're on your own. Not her funeral. no skin off her back. She pulled out her own map, unfolding it over her knees since the table was stained and crowded with empty dishes. Unnar squinted at the drawing after attempting, and failing, to move his chair. What's this then? That's a proper map. Looks like doodles to me, lass. No offense, just more of them. The Dunmer leaned forward, his eyes tracking across the paper. What are those concentric lines? Vera looked up, nodding. Not a bad question. Not a bad question. Elevation. And these numbers here? He tapped an elongated dark gray fingernail against the legend. The merc had nice hands, Vera thought suddenly. Long, strong fingers with clearly defined joints. Pale scar across 3 knuckles on the left one. She peeled her eyes away, refocusing. That's my own notes. Mostly idiosyncratic stuff. Won't be that useful to you. Ciri seemed curious though, and she didn't see any harm in elaborating. I keep a record of how long it takes me to get places, depending on the season and the weather. I see. What about the overlay right here? The side of his hand brushed against her wrist as he reached around. Surely not doodles. Vera chuckled and tried to ignore the way her skin tingled at the brief contact. The merc ran hot. At this distance, she could feel the heat coming off him, presumably a difference in base bodily temperature, since he didn't look fevered. Some species adaptation, perhaps. These marks are where I've spotted large predators. Square for bear, circle for saber cat, crosses for wolves. She tapped her finger next to where he was pointing. See? This cave here used to just have skeevers. About 3 months ago, a she-bear moved in with 2 cubs. The younger one died. Wolfpack got to him. So she's gone a bit touchy. So while this road here shows up on the maps you might buy in the market, it's no good for a lone traveler. And what are these? Ah, right. That was her, using her own world's alphabet. Fortunately, just the first letter, not a full word, and thus plausibly deniable. Just a personal cipher for marking resources. Distract him.
Say, if I want to pick up some skeever hides.
She traced a line to a spot southwest of the bear cave. I would go right around here. There's a farm about a mile upriver, and their garbage washes up along this shallow bend here, so the skeevers have gotten nice and fat. I'm expecting the current to change once we're over the spring melt, so they'll probably migrate in another month. Clever, Ciri trailed, looking up from the map to meet her gaze. I am starting to see your point about the bandits. Ahem. Artwork. Vera nodded, irrationally pleased at the praise, before stuffing the unwelcome emotions back where they came from. Then again, fuck it. This was something she was good at. If that made Demon Chops less likely to embark on his "we're mean, lean, killing machines little girl" routine, all the better. See, Teldrin, I told you she'd be useful. Unnar was beaming at her like a proud parent. I can smell these things, I'm telling you. Hold your horses. Vera held her pinky against her mark for the forsworn encampment and pressed her thumb to the spot where the river crooked around the cliffs. There's a little path the rams use to get to the water on that side. The cliffs there are steep, but it's the shortest way to the redoubt if you don't want to trek all the way around to the northern part. The cliffs will give some higher ground if you want to pick them off at long range. The other side, you're both downhill and upwind from them. She looked up. I'll take you all the way to the foot of this cliff, to where the path starts, but no further. I'll wait for a day for you two to get back. I'll have healing potions and bandages if you come back banged up. After a day, if you're still not back, I'll head back to Markarth. What if the Forsworn capture us, lass? Won't you sweep in to the rescue? Unnar approximated heartbroken chagrin, not very convincingly. What if they do unspeakable things to our remains? Vera blew a raspberry. The Nord guffawed, slapping his knee. Your remains won't care, one way or another. I'll make an offering to RK on your behalf, if you'd like. She turned to the Dunmer. Any funerary rites I should know about. Whom should I beseech on your account, if it comes to that? She had meant it as a joke, but something bitter passed in the Dunmer's eyes. He stuffed it down quickly. Won't matter a whit, Outlander. Not at this stage. Vera shrugged. Fine with me. She opened the purse and counted the coins. Weiss. What are we looking for anyway? Boom Nar smiled broadly. Why, a sword, of course. Vera nodded. Not her problem. Up to the foot of the cliffs. No further. She left her 150 septimes with Bothala before meeting the duo at the city gates. Traveling with them turned out to be oddly easy. The Nord and the Dunmer had an efficient routine, established over what Vera was guessing were months, if not years, of joint travel. And while they were clearly unfamiliar with the area, they didn't make stupid mistakes. She hunted but outsourced dressing the kills to Sero, who turned out better at it. Frankly, Unnar didn't do shit except for tending the campfire and eating the food they cooked, and Vera was more than happy to be left to her own devices, trapping fowl and supplementing their meals with small game and whatever she could forage, mostly early greens, tender and juicy and sweet with spring sap. The summer Vera arrived had been arid, gold dry grass and powdery dust gilting the sun-warmed summits. Even if this year proved more rainy, there would still be a period of scarcity right around mid-year, and then the berries would start coming in, and the mushrooms after that. Then, starchy roots, fat from the warm months of soaking up sunlight and storing it as sugar. Unner was his usual self on the road. No personality change there. The same loud, rude, irreverent humor, a goofy bear of a man, and as deceptively good-natured. The Dunmer, for his part, eased off his sardonic, growled half-threats after that moment in the tavern when something had passed between them over the map. Or before that, maybe, when Vera saw his snarling for what it was, and he saw her noticing. Recognition mirrored back, as if, in that moment, the languages their respective lives had left them with converged into some shared meaning. Demon Chops was abrasive, but he wasn't stupid, or unobservant. Either way, whatever was growing there instead wasn't comfortable. Vera made sure she never had her back turned to either of the men, but it had settled into a kind of grudging camaraderie born of tired feet and shared fires, a pinched feeling, sore and almost sweet, that tugged at some long buried heartstring, familiar, like plugging herself into a well-oiled mechanism. Once upon a time, Vera had been a part of something just like it. Bigger, when everyone was still alive. Split City was held together through circuits of constant migration, on a kind of rotating schedule of flight and foraging, a careful choreography of divided tasks, once there was enough of them to share the labor. A long time ago, the cities of her world had been sedentary. Before ending up in Markarth, Vera couldn't have imagined it. How would you survive? Resources were always thin, but after the Citadel raided them in '89, there was barely anything left to scavenge, so you had to stay on the move. Jules had broached the topic first, or maybe Saeed. The memory had grown fuzzy around the edges, like a heat mirage. Not that it mattered. They talked about heading west, going towards what had once been Lake Huron. Used to be cottage country, Jules had explained. His great-great-grandparents were from those parts. Boats and farms and quaint little houses, most of them decomposing ruins, but no gangs. Or, well, fewer anyway. Martha and Vera had been hesitant. Ced had thrown his support behind Jules, and not just because he and Jules were lovers either. Ced, soft-eyed, with the scar across his mouth like a fishhook. The strategist of their group. 2 steps ahead, just quieter about it. Dima had been against it, categorically, but, in the end, he was outnumbered. It was ironic, in the end, which of them ended up implementing the plan. For several years, it was just a hypothetical, something that tied their group together as much as their other bonds did. A joint cause, the imaginary of a possible future. Vera shoved her hungry ghosts aside, turned her face to the sky, the setting sun warm on her skin. The breeze carried the tang of warm juniper and the crisp coolness of snowmelt, A lovely smell. Point was, it had been easy to fall into a rhythm with her two oddball companions, which was probably why she had allowed her guard to slip. No. Absolutely. No. Vera stared in horror at the pieces of armor. The term was a vast overstatement that Umnar was carefully laying out on the grass in front of her. It had taken them about a week to get to their intended destination. Largely without a hitch. She should have known something like this would happen. It had all proceeded way too smoothly. Her eyes darted to Teldrin, not that she expected to find much support from those quarters. The Dunmer was pinching the bridge of his nose with the air of someone who grasped fully the futility of trying to dissuade the mad Nord from his chosen course of action. I am not putting this on, Unnar. No. I mean, why? What do you mean, why, lass? I thought it was obvious. We need that sword. The Forsworn have said sword in their possession. There is how many, Teldrin? 26. The last time I con. 26 Forsworn and 3 of us. Surely you can see how that's a problem. Vera glared at him mutely before gesturing with both hands at the armor. Actually, there are 26 Forsworn and 2 of you, since I'm not going. And I definitely don't see how this outfit here will solve the mathematical challenge you're facing. Unner grinned like a hungry troll spotting a ram. Way I figure it, same rules apply, lass. You don't have to come anywhere near the encampment proper. All we need is to get past the sentries, so they don't turn us into target practice before we've even set foot into the camp, which is where you come in, Snowberry. You're going to sneak us in. Time to earn your keep, eh? Vera tried, and failed, not to sputter in entirely justified outrage. Unner patted the armor on the ground. As your prisoners. She opened her mouth, and then closed it with an audible clack. She gestured to herself, in case the referent was unclear. Took you. She gestured at Unnar, and then, belatedly, included Demon Chops. As prisoners. Forsworn women are very fierce, I hear. Savage. Feral even. Deadly opponents in combat. Setting aside the fact that I am not going anywhere. I am not a Forsworn woman. They'll be able to spot the subterfuge a mile away. I don't move like them. I don't speak like them. Do you seriously think they won't be able to tell? Unner shrugged, not the least bit discouraged. You're Breton. Put on the outfit. Add a bit of face paint to make you look fiercer. Nord, you are almost twice my size, and probably about 3 times my weight. And she pointed an angry finger at Sero, who wasn't doing shit to stop this disaster from toddling off a cliff. Looks like he could fillet me in his sleep. Demon Chops offered her a slight bow. I would make sure I was a weight for the occasion, if that helps. Asshole. Unnar scratched his head, meditating on this unexpected hurdle. You might have a point there, Snowberry. We'll have to really make sure the face paint is convincing. Teldrin will help you with that, eh? The merc had the decency to groan. I don't recall face painting being part of my contract with you, Unnar. You hear this, Snowberry? Unnar rubbed his beard in aggrieved contemplation. See what I must contend with. This lout gets to muck around in mud or ash or whatever it is those Forsworn used to decorate themselves with, and then he gets to put his grubby paws all over a pretty Breton lass. But no, not good enough. He wants me to pay him extra for it. As a matter of fact, Ciro interjected, I don't recall my grubby paws being included in your new associate's contract either. He turned to Vera, his red eyes glinting in the semi-darkness. If you want my advice, Outlander, I suggest we both ask for more gold. We could split it later, if you're interested. Divines. Lo, this treachery. They are uniting against me, the unconscionable scoundrels. Unnar wailed at the night sky, brandishing both hands as if to call upon them the wrath of heaven. Be quiet, you madman. Vera shushed at him aggressively. You're going to bring the Forsworn down upon us. How had she gotten herself into this mess and this completely insane conversation? Why was she even discussing the armor? Nothing remotely like this was part of her original agreement with the Nord, though Unnar seemed to have a fondness for reinterpreting the terms of a contract in new and creative ways. Still, if these two wanted to charge a forsworn camp all by their lonesome and become the Hagraven's playthings, that was certainly not her responsibility. She promised to wait a day, and she'd keep the promise, but anything else was not going to be her problem. Except, of course, it didn't quite work that way in practice. 26 to 2 wasn't just terrible odds. It was a suicide mission. They weren't walking out of there minimally. Bickering in circles was delaying the inevitable. If we don't make it out, lass, then I can't pay you your full amount on account of being dead and all that. Unnar tried, approaching the problem from the now very familiar pecuniary direction. I've got it. He slapped his knee in time with the new, no doubt incrementally worse, idea. You didn't best us in fair combat. Cunning and treacherous snake that you forsworn women are. You overcame us with your feminine wiles. Vera blinked. What, both? Well, not at the same time. The mad Nord amended, before turning to Sarah with an inquisitive look. Right. Or at the same time? The Dunmer rubbed his forehead with the air of someone trying to ward off a migraine and growled something about Mafala. I don't care how much you're paying me, Unna. I'm not answering that. Bah! The Nord grinned. Spoil sport. Look, lass, if they see our hands are bound, it won't matter. They're not gonna ask the hows and the whys and the how comes. You just need to march us in there like you mean it, and then we'll take care of the rest. He squinted slyly. I'll raise your pay. 300 septims on the other end. How about it? Still no. She crossed her arms over her chest, as if that could protect her from the Nord's unbelievable pushiness and harebrained ideas. 400. Cyril coughed into his fist. Yeah. And once the Forsworn resurrect my corpse, it can go shamble off and put that coin to good use by erecting a shrine to my stupidity. No fucking way. No, Undar. Vera took a deep breath. Why don't you two don a disguise then? Just! She pointed her chin at the obnoxious piece of armor. Wherever you found this set. And don't tell me, because I don't want to know. I'm sure you could have lifted another one off a male Forsworn. Unnar heaved a despondent sigh. The sort of sigh that was meant to demonstrate how much of a paragon of patience he was being. Well, lass, they're mostly Breton. No offense, but you lot are itty-bitty. He demonstrated just how itty-bitty Bretons were by holding his thumb and forefinger about an inch apart, squinting at it with one eye. Besides, that armor doesn't cover much, if you catch my meaning. I'm just too big and he squinted, too blue or gray. Which is it, Ciro? It's irrelevant, for starters. The Dunmer wrapped an oilcloth around the whetstone he'd been using to hone his blade and shoved the bundle into the pack at his feet. We are wasting time. As I recall, the deal took us only as far as the bottom of the path. He pointed the business end of his blade at Vera, the dark, intricately carved metal catching the firelight. She made good on that. There is a long fissure atop the plateau about 60 paces south of where you'll come up. I've never used it myself, but you can see it from that cliff on the other side of the river. Vera pointed her thumb over his shoulder. It'll give you cover until the towers. Teldrin met her gaze and nodded. My thanks. A trace of a smile touched his lip, the tracework of his tattoo drawing her attention to the asymmetry of his smirk. There was a kind of spare minimalism to him, now that her eyes had gotten used to his odd high-contrast coloring. Not so much arresting anymore, as almost peaceful. The sort of aesthetics that didn't clamor for your constant attention with being insistently pretty. Vera dragged her gaze from the Dunmer and returned the bow she had set aside earlier in favor of trying to wave the horrid armor away back into her lap. It was already restrung, so she busied herself with rubbing tallow into the wood to keep it waterproof. Not a task that needed to be done right this moment, but it would have to be done eventually anyway. She was drawing this out. Stupid. Just rip off the Band-Aid. Another theatrical sigh from the buffoon-in-chief. You're really not going to help us, lass. No. She looked up, trying to break through the Nord's clowning to whatever was beneath it. Look, it's an unnecessary risk. It makes no strategic sense. Yeah, it's flashy. And marginally clever if you can pull it off, maybe. But I'm telling you, we won't pull it off. They'll know I'm not one of them, the same way I'd know you two are not from the Reach, even if I didn't know you from Adam. Who is this Adam you speak of, lass? Vera waved it off. A prat. From what I hear, it's not the point. I won't improve your chances by irritating the Forsworn with costuming. Just, either way, it's not a good idea. Can't you find another sword? There's not, exactly, a deficit from what I can tell. Unnar shook his head. Wish that we could, but no. It has to be this one. Well, he stretched, and then placed his axe ceremoniously on the ground before him, giving the weapon a few loving pats. Since you think we're as good as dead, Sero and I, won't you do an old dying warrior a final favor and at least try the outfit? Vera threw a pebble at his head, which Unnar dodged. I'm not here to fulfill sordid Nord fantasies about mountain savages. What about sordid Dunmer fantasies? Will those do you better? The Nord turned to the mark. Want to share one of those before we go? Not for all the gold in Skyrim. What happened to your sense of humor, you joyless mud crab? Unless you think I can dispatch the Forsworn with barbs, I suggest we get going. It'll be dawn soon. I'd rather not tangle with them in broad daylight. The demented Nord switched tactics again, drawing himself up and bristling with false outrage. What of our other arrangement, lass? Would you abandon your future husband in his time of need? I demand deference from my bride-to-be. He pounded his fist on his knee. Yeah, well, as your future widow, I suggest you take your demands and shove them, unless you want to first bequeath all your possessions to me, in written form. The Dunmer emitted a sound that sounded suspiciously like a choked snort. When Vera glanced his way, he was shaking his head, his hand over his eyes. Well, Unnar scratched his beard and thought, you got a point there. Idiots. Vera sighed, glanced at the Dunmer, and motioned at his tobacco pouch. Roll me one, will ya? He cocked an eyebrow. I didn't realize you smoked. This might be a titch. Strong. I'll survive. As you wish. She wasn't sure what he was using in lieu of paper. Some very thin, gossamer-like material that put her in mind of dragonfly wings, but more supple. Or perhaps the gills of a mushroom. She found her gaze lingering on him when he was sealing the roll-up. A quick swipe of his tongue, efficient, then a practiced flick of his fingers as he tightened the cigarette. He caught her looking and smirked. Light? Vera drew back as a tiny flame swelled between his thumb and forefinger. She lit up awkwardly, drew the smoke deep into her lungs, rolling it around her mouth before blowing it out through her nose. The mixture was smooth, a bit minty. Whatever the active ingredient was, it wasn't nicotine. Some other chemical, sharper, with a faster edge. Any final directions from either of you? The Nord's ribbled mask was flaking off quickly, revealing the alarming glint of nascent battle fury. As a matter of fact, Vera watched him warily as he unhooked the amulet from around his neck before tossing it in her lap. Hold on to that until I'm back, will you? It's meant for a very special lady. Wouldn't want the Hagravens to get the wrong idea. The thing was, they probably were going to die, all things considered. She ignored the sudden pang of sadness. What about you, Dunmer? Last directives? His eyes drifted to the skies, and then he grinned, all sharp edges and white teeth, and crooked a finger at her. How about a personal question? Won't matter if we don't make it, will it? Unnir scowled, pantomiming displeasure. Pause to yourself, sellsword. Sellsword.
I don't pay you for that. Oh,
Now he worries about the terms. Vera scooted closer to where Demon Chops was sitting. He hadn't been particularly interested in personal details before, which suited her perfectly fine, except that now she was curious. He leaned down, close enough that she could feel his breath tickling her ear. He smelled like he looked. A sharp, slightly spicy scent with a hint of mineral heat. Abrupt, but not unpleasant. Well? Vera asked, suddenly acutely aware of her own skin. Where are you really from, Outlander? He whispered. And then he straightened and busied himself with his blade. Vera got to her feet, turned away to look at the dark water of the river. Some large nocturnal bird flew above, briefly shading Master's pale glow with its wingspan. If you come back alive, I'll tell you, she said to the water. A safe bet. She didn't watch them leave, busying herself with tending to the fire instead. Vera maintained the campfire for only as long as it took to keep their things from accumulating too much moisture when the temperature dropped below the dew point. Coal drifted off the water, pooling at the bottom of the steep river gorge. The sun would not reach into the ravine for 2-3 hours after sunrise, but the inconvenience of needing to dry everything out paled against the risk of having the smoke bring unwanted visitors. When the eastern horizon paled and the stars turned translucent, Vera kicked what remained of the burning driftwood apart, scattering the embers. If things went poorly for Under and Ciro, especially if they went poorly early on, chances of a forsworn scouting party to root out their base camp was high. She had chosen a spot far enough away and inconvenient enough to access without making a ruckus, but the risk was not null. She looked up, her eyes tracing the scatter of the mage, still bright against the shrinking darkness in the western quadrant. Perhaps she should have tried harder to dissuade them. Then again, everyone was free to choose their own ending if they could, and most didn't get that luxury. True enough of the Nord, but had Demon Chops really chosen this? Was the promise of coin really worth that risk? How the hell did he balance those scales? Something irked her. An irritating little splinter of a thought, lodged at the back of her mind ever since her quip about Dunmer funeral rites. The way his mouth had twisted and his eyes had darted away at her question. Odd for a fellow who, at other times, had no problem with weaponizing eye contact. Won't matter a whit at this stage, he'd said. Nords, at least, cared deeply about their afterlives. Whatever Sovngarde really was, its promise seemed to override the fear of a messy death. Were Dunmer different in this respect? Barring unnatural causes, like, say, being sacrificed in some unpleasant Hagraven ritual and then eaten, because why waste good meat? Myr had longer lifespans. Perhaps, after a while, you just got fed up with the whole thing. Vera kicked the thought aside and got herself busy. She was going to need sleep. She had chosen this spot in part because of the beehive of small caves dotting the cliffside, where water erosion and winds had eaten away at the rock, forming shallow hollows, high enough above ground to keep skeevers and other wildlife from getting into food supplies, low enough that they could be accessed without climbing equipment. About 50 paces upriver along the stony beach, she discovered what she was looking for. A small cave, 2 meters deep, shaped like a teardrop. The rocks below provided decent handholds, and Vera hoisted herself up to the mouth of the hollow, careful not to slip on the moist stones. Inside, an old bird's nest, little more than a snarl of dried twigs and desiccated grass, was the only trace of the cave's former occupants. Vera brushed the debris aside, shouldered her pack into the opening, and climbed down. It was high enough that dragging their equipment into her new shelter would require some maneuvering, but a short craggy tree growing from a crevice above the cave would provide the lever she needed for her rope. By the time she was done, the sky had turned to soft pink, and Master hung pale and ghostly at the edge of the horizon. Vera settled inside the cave, her back against her pack, the pile of bedrolls cushioning her from the ground. She fidgeted with the unfinished cigarette in her fingers. She had not intended to keep the remaining blunt after her first lungful of the foreign mixture, but old habits of frugality died hard. Hoarding elevated to a philosophy of life, a shield against uncertain futures. She sorely needed sleep, but she felt restless and strangely unmoored. Perhaps the futility of waiting was starting to grate. Then again, perhaps the pair were going to come to their senses once they realized what they were up against and hightail it back, probably with a pack of Forsworn on their heels. Vera fidgeted, her hand drawn to her bow, its smooth curve reassuring against her palm. Boredom. The most underrated emotion. Boredom meant you were safe. What did she even know about the Forsworn? Her understanding was mostly limited to observation from afar, rather than any sort of conceptual grasp of their place in the mess that was Skyrim politics. They were native Reachmen according to Luvinar and Breton, in designation if not quite in phenotype or descent. About 15 years before Vera's arrival, they had rebelled and were driven back. Since then, they were known to masquerade in plain sight. Your neighbor, your fellow miner, your nondescript customer that came in every Sundas to buy a health tonic, otherwise known as a cordial in every sense of the term. But Bothella's clever labels spared her clients from having to explain their more frivolous purchases to their significant others could have a double life as a Forsworn. Or so people said, a little breathless with the pleasure of suspected conspiracy. In that sense, perhaps they were Breton, in the way that the largest rival gangs that tore Split City into two violent, mutually annihilating halves were sometimes described as American. At best, ironic nostalgia, a referent for a myriad identities only united on old maps, as mythical as the giant sea dwellers of Terra Incognita. At worst, a way to make one's own hands feel less bloody, to shift that weight to others, with longer and prouder and better remembered traditions of past cruelties. There was the more sinister sense too, whispers of warriors who cut out their own hearts to be replaced with something that was neither heart nor human. Stories of Hagravens that had bartered some of their humanity for odd powers that came with bird talons and a few other dubious trade-offs, but no wings. Beyond that, Vera only knew the surfaces of what she had been able to glimpse from a safe distance. They wore little, but didn't seem to be bothered by the cold, either from a habit of repeated exposure or through some magical or alchemical intervention. They did not favor metalwork for weapons or armor. They had some kind of symbolic relationship with stags, and the men's headdresses often featured a complex weave of antlers and branches, like some ancient woodland spirit from the third volume of the encyclopedias about the old religions of her dying world. Before the unworshipped showed up and swept up those who remained into their deceptively simple, impossible service. So her grim jokes aside, the thought of what would actually happen to the Nord and the Dunmer once they failed, and Vera had no doubt that they would fail, was all the more unpleasant for its uncertainties. This would have been a good time for her imagination to draw a blank, or at least a modesty curtain over the possible scenarios. But, of course, it did no such thing. If they were lucky, they would die quickly. But that was the thing with luck. You had it until it ran out. She had promised to wait. A long, pointless, and potentially risky exercise. But a promise was a promise. Eventually, she nodded off. Vera woke up with a jolt. An odd noise had yanked her out of shallow sleep. Well, that, and the crick in her neck. The sun's orange rays danced on the water, the river like molten gold. She'd overslept. Again. Vera tightened her hand on her bow and turned her head, slowly, so as not to draw attention to herself, and almost tumbled off her pile of bedrolls. A purple blob was gliding across the narrow strip of gravel beach, a coiling, pulsing, iridescent knot of ethereal tendrils, like vapor slowly coiling on itself inside a glass flask. Vera blinked. Changes. She turned her head all the way, and suddenly the light dissolved, like something smudged out with a grubby thumb. In its place stood a mud crab, a juvenile hatchling, judging by the size. Its eye stalk stretched upward, beady little eyes tracking Vera's movements. It chirped in warning and skittered backwards. What the fuck? She turned her head, bringing the critter into her peripheral vision. The mud crab reblobified, its outline now hosting the violet glow once again. The shimmer was familiar, exactly like the tantalizingly glimmer of Lovenar's gem. "Did you swallow one of those enchantment crystals, buddy?" The mud crab chittered menacingly. "Oh yeah? You're pretty much a rat in a chitin suit, so don't get mouthy." She twisted out of the cave, dangling her legs over the drop. She stretched her neck, the muscles screaming in protest. The mud crab raised its claw and brandished it in warning. "Have weapon, will nip." The gesture was so similar to Unnar's earlier quip about itty-bitty Bretons that Vera found herself snorting. "Not impressed, huh?" She jumped down from her perch, her fur-soled boots doing little to muffle the rattle of river pebbles beneath her feet. "Let's see if you've been keeping an odd diet." She took a step forward. "And if not, I bet you'll taste great with some wild garlic and a bit of butter." The mud crab inched sideways, its gray carapace catching the sun's refracted glare. Vera stalked closer. She wouldn't need the bow. For a specimen this young, a well-placed kick to the head should do the trick, as long as she could dodge the claw. The little critters were experts at ruining a perfectly good pair of boots. Apparently, this particular mud crab was wizened to the cruel ways of the food chain because it retracted its pincer and took off, lightning fast, zipping sideways along the bank, its legs clicking against the stones. After a moment of hesitation, Vera ran after it, following it upriver. The purple glow only returned as she kept the creature in her peripheral vision. Just as she was closing in on it, the treacherous crustacean lurched sideways, disappearing behind a rocky outcrop that jutted out into the river, forcing Vera to slow down at the water's edge. She weighed the advantage of a crab meat supper against the dubious pleasure of wading ankle-deep in the icy river. But if the little scavenger had, in fact, gobbled up one of those gems, because what else could explain its glowing tendencies, then cold feet wouldn't be such a high price to pay. Still, keeping one's boots dry and one's feet warm was another one of those underrated life necessities. Vera eyed the rocky jut. "You might have 8 legs, buddy, but see, this is where you're not taking into account the simple evolutionary fact that I have opposable thumbs." Midway up the outcrop, Vera frowned, staring in consternation at the small fissure in the stone she was using as a handhold. She was talking to a mud crab. It felt perfectly natural under the circumstances. Who else was she supposed to talk to out here? But something about it still irked her, a feeling like she was missing something crucial and rather obvious. A noise drew her attention from the irritating thought, and she clambered up the rest of the way until she reached the narrow platform at the top of the rocky spur. On the other side of the stony outcrop formation, a narrow tongue of pebbly shore extended out into the water. Her mud crab friend was making its way across it at a deceptively leisurely pace, but Vera's earlier culinary intentions slipped away. She muttered a curse. The entire riverbank was littered with swirling purple knots. Either the local mud crabs were experimenting with a restricted mineral diet, or something was very seriously wrong with her. Vera rubbed her eyes, but the visual distortion remained. She folded herself into a cross-legged position, bringing the bow to her lap. A titch strong, the Dunmer had warned her when she had asked him to share his smoking mixture. What the hell had she been thinking, making that stupid request in the first place? Idiot. More importantly, was the effect something specific to mud crabs, or was it more general? She glanced dubiously at her own hands. They seemed perfectly normal. No eerie glow. Hopefully, whatever chemical was causing the light show, it wasn't permanent. She would bring the roll up to Bothala and see if the old woman could reverse engineer the ingredients. Vera turned her gaze back to the chittering critters below. Something had drawn the little bastards to a spot at the edge of a shallow pool where the current slowed and swirled. An old rowboat had been dragged partway onto the beach, but the mud crabs didn't seem interested in that. They were all clustering a few feet away, around a dark shape bobbing in the water. Mud crabs were, by and large, opportunistic scavengers, which meant that the shape was most likely a dead body. Vera straightened, fished out an arrow from the quiver at her hip, and drew her bow, aiming at the largest creature. She released the arrow, the string ringing with a satisfying twang, and the mud crab shuddered, collapsed on its belly and went still. Its buddies hissed and whistled, but didn't stop their meal. "Shoo, you fuckers, I don't want your dinner. Just want the boat." She dispatched 2 more mud crabs before the rest of the throng abandoned their prey, launching themselves into the water or skittering along the gravel towards the shelter of the cliffs. Vera climbed down. The stench of decomposition, still faint but unmistakable, hit her nostrils once she was a few feet away from the boat. Vera glanced at the dead body, a bloated back covered in the reds and browns of Imperial armor, swayed gently with the ebb and flow. She approached the dinghy. Several burlap sacks lay eviscerated at the bottom of the boat, their cargo of wheat and potatoes strewn over the weather-bleached planks, but the little vessel was otherwise dry on the inside. The mud crabs were beginning to coalesce into an irate militia some 20 paces away, so Vera planted her palms on the hull and shoved. Her feet weren't destined to stay dry, apparently. She waded through the shallows, teeth clenched against the bracingly cold water sipping into her boots. Another shove, and the dinghy wobbled, the current rotating the bow to face downriver. She tried the rudder, a creaky but function affair, and as the current yanked the skiff forward, she hoisted herself into it, inelegantly, her boots slipping on the damp wood. She narrowly avoided pitching forward and busting her nose on the planks, but then she righted herself and steered the craft along the shoreline to the site of their erstwhile camp. If shit hit the fan and Unnar's insane scheme brought a party of Forsworn down on her head, she'd have a quick means of escape. As long as she managed to beach the skiff before the rapids, and scat. Vera whiled away the remaining hours, cleaning out the dinghy and checking it for leaks, collecting river clams for her dinner, and attempting, unsuccessfully, to dry out her boots in the waning sunlight until the sun dipped behind the cliffs. She weighed the risks of a campfire against the allure of having dry toes and a cooked dinner. If the Forsworn hadn't showed up by now, perhaps they weren't going to bother at all. In the end, the promise of modest creature comforts prevailed, so she made a small driftwood fire in the shelter of the cliffs. An evening wind had picked up, scattering the narrow plume of smoke over the water. By the time Masser climbed once more above the eastern horizon, and the sky turned from lapis blue to inky black, Vera was thoroughly fed up with pointless waiting. This was it. They weren't coming back. She chose to interpret the queasy, hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach as hunger rather than loss. She used a stick to maneuver her clams and cold-baked potatoes out of the cinders. Most of the potatoes from the dinghy had either rotted or sprouted, but she found a couple that still looked and smelled edible. Either way, she'd eaten worse. Since her relocation to her new world, the chronic vitamin deficiencies she and everyone she knew had suffered from were beginning to right themselves. She'd been lucky compared to others. She had managed to keep all her teeth, at least. She scoffed down her food, counting down every chew, 10 per bite. Trying to reteach herself to eat more slowly was still a struggle. She cast her eyes towards the cliffs above. Perhaps she could climb up there and take one final look. The Forewarned camp was a hike, but if nothing else, it would be an expedient way to test whether the effect of the Dunmer's smoking mixture extended to humans, as well as to gauge the distance of its efficacy. And if the camp turned out to be quiet, then that would mean that her companions were well and truly dead, or worse, and she could load up the dinghy and head out. She'd dock by Blind Cliff Cave before the rapids and cut across to Carthwaston. And from there, she might be able to hitch a ride back to Markarth if Anethak was feeling generous. Besides, she should probably bring the news of Luvinar's passing. The old alchemists had supplied the little settlement with healing potions when communication with Markarth slowed down during the winter months. The miners were probably wondering what had happened. At least don't bullshit yourself, V. You just hate leaving them behind. There's no helping it now. Should have talked them out of it when you had the chance. Why did her saner self always sound like Martha? Vera got to her feet, the adrenaline sharpening her senses. She looked at the sky. Masser was already dipping behind the cliffs. She had fulfilled her part of the bargain. She was free to go. Sorry, Martha, love. Of the two of us, You were always the wiser one. She fished out the roll-up from her pocket, pinched off the burnt end, and brought the burning tip of a stick to the flaking remainder. One fast inhalation, released quickly, and then she extinguished the blunt against the sole of her boot, still wet, stuffing it back into her pocket. Hopefully, Othello would have some additional insights about the mixture. Either way, waste not. And the thoughts scattered. The screech, high-pitched, metallic, and entirely inhuman, sent her scrambling for her bow before her mind could classify the nature of the danger. She dove for the safety of the cliffs, boots sliding on gravel, small stones tumbling down and ricocheting off rocks. A low, mounting whump like a bomb falling, and then a crash and the bassy whoosh of fire. Vera gritted her teeth against the sickly freefall of rising panic. The bow felt slippery in her palm, an arrow knocked against the rising terror. She forced herself out of her shelter through sheer force of will, her body pivoting on autopilot towards the approaching ruckus. Two lilac blobs, one bright and one faint, so close together they looked joined at the hip, were tumbling down the narrow path from the cliff top. And dotting the dark outline of the cliffs and blotting out the starlight were at least another dozen purple blobs, pulsing in perfect harmony. Vera gulped for air, suddenly in short supply. Don't think. There. One more, against Masser's tawny flank, purple but tinged with red and rimmed with a necrotic darkness that brought bile to her throat. A perfect ball of flame coalesced in the center of the shimmering mass of tendrils, feeding off the purple glimmer as if it were kindling. She lined the shot, an odd, uncomfortable proposition when relying only on her peripheral vision to take aim. The honing glow vanished the second she tried to look at a target head-on, leaving only darkness in its wake. She let go of the arrow. The bowstring twanged, air whistling, and then a meaty thwack followed, another inhuman screech on its tail. Get out of here, Outlander. The Dunmer. Something grazed Vera's calf, blinding white pain, then numbness, and she stumbled back, her only thought on the dinghy. Jetted moving. She hobbled to the boat, tossing her bow inside. Hurry, she screamed over her shoulder, strident, with the metallic tang of fear on her tongue. A serrated arrow bit into the skiff's hull, not a foot away from her hand. Help me get him in. She whipped around. Ciri was barely recognizable. Blood and bruises and burns, one eye swollen shut to a narrow red slit. The Nord, he was half hauling, half supporting, looked like a slab of meat. Don't think. She grabbed Unnar's belt and helped the Dunmer heave his employer into the dinghy like a sack of potatoes. Push, they shoved at the hull together. A fireball flew over their heads and skittered across the dark surface, pale steam billowing in its wake. Vera grabbed the edge of the skiff. The boat wobbled, and then the current caught it, yanking her after it, the water shockingly cold even through her armor. She bit her cheek and tried to dig in her heels. Zero tumbled into the dinghy, rocking it and knocking it sideways to the current. Vera pushed again, her breaths coming in short gasps. One more push, something grabbing her by the back of her coat, and then she was dragged into the skiff. She fell in a heap next to the unresponsive Nord. Can you steer us to safety? Ciro's voice sounded strained, edged with urgency. Keep them off us. Vera managed through chattering teeth. She crawled to the rudder, yanking it towards her. The boat righted itself, the fast current propelling it downriver. She chanced a look at the cliffs. The purple distortions had faded. She couldn't see whether they were being pursued. On the starboard side, the Dunmer's face and hands flashed into view, flame-lit. The ball of fire, small at first, barely a flicker, then growing brighter and hotter, the core pulsing white. He grew it in increments, molding fire between his palms, like shaping a piece of dough, his battered features twisting with the effort. Vera winced. Holy hell, but they had done a number on him. He held the spell aloft, squinting into the darkness. And then, he released it. It went flying down the gorge, the rocks illuminated in time with the missile's passage. Vera didn't check to see if it hit anything. The cliffs rushed by, the river bending around the island. She glanced behind them, trying to catch that purple glow again. At least she got the answer to her question. The effect wasn't specific to mud crabs. The boat rushed on, and with each passing minute, the itchy feeling between her shoulder blades receded a little, as if the target on her back grew fainter. Maybe they would make it out of this. There would be a nasty patch of underwater boulders right around the bend, then relatively smooth sailing before the rapids. The skiff wouldn't survive those, not with 3 people weighing it down, not to mention their gear, but if they could just... The Nord suddenly shot bolt upright and bellowed an ear-curling curse. The boat lurched to the side, taking water. Vera threw herself to the other side in counterweight, trying to right the craft, but Unnar wobbled, trying to keep his balance before collapsing in the same direction. The last thing she heard before tumbling headfirst into the river was Sarah's hissed expletive. Something about Molag Bal's hairy nether regions. She hit the water with a painful jolt, the cold like a sudden vise of icy fire tightening around her lungs. Vera groped for the boat's edge, but her waterlogged armor dragged her back, her muscles shaking with the effort of staying afloat. Her feet tried to find purchase, but the river was too deep. The boat, now at the mercy of the current, rushed forward. Another fireball, not one of Sarah's, so return fire most likely, sank and fizzled inches away from her head. Vera screamed and went under. Her lungs seized, the thermal shock locking her muscles. She panicked, disoriented in the darkness, tried to kick to the surface, but her legs felt bound and unwieldy. Water rushed into her mouth and nose, the pain and sheer terror crowding out everything else. She kicked with all her force, breaching the surface and gulping a mouthful of air before being tugged under again. Her left shin slammed against an underwater rock, the agony momentarily overriding her panic, and then she was dragged over it, like laundry scraped over a washboard. Then open water again, with no sense of direction, of up and down. That's it. That's how it ends. Her vision went blurry, fading at the edges, tunneling. She must have blacked out. Awareness returned with a lurch, and the sensation of her back hitting solid ground. Vera found enough energy to roll to her side and retch into the shallow water, cramps twisting her insides in long, painful spasms. When nothing else would come out, she fell back, shaking with exhaustion, shock, and hypothermia. Above her, the Dunmer's face loomed into view. Done? He hoisted her up by the armpits and dragged her farther up the riverbank with a labored grunt. More, Vera rattled, freezing. Off. He nodded, stopped dragging, stepped over her, and busied himself with removing her gear. She tried to aid him in the process, but her fingers weren't obeying. Gone? Vera managed through chattering teeth. Safe for the moment, though I have no idea where we are. The Dunmer fumbled with the laces holding her trousers in place, then tried to yank at them, but the wet knots had fused tight. He growled in frustration. Something about his expression suddenly struck Vera as utterly comical. A half-forgotten memory from her younger years, of an impatient lover brought low by the intricacies of female garments. Even then, a good brawl was already something you might draw your weapon over. She snorted, and then spluttered, water trickling from her nose and sending her down the path of uncontrollable laughter despite her raw lungs. Demon Chop stared down at her in mute condemnation, wiping at the blood trickling from his broken lip. The scab was cracked, and the wound seeped. Something amusing, Outlander? You look like... Hiccup. First time you're thwarted by... Hiccup. Snort. A woman's choice of wardrobe, Vera choked out, a great howl of laughter bursting from her chest before curdling into a cough. Next time the day concludes with you asking me to remove your clothes, I'll strive to be better prepared, he retorted dryly, though I might have enough magic left to burn them off you, if you'd rather. Bad day? Vera managed, cold and laughter and the aftershocks of terror rattling through her in equal measure. Not the worst ending to it, I suppose. He met her gaze, his expression more grimace than grin. Azura cursed. This won't budge. You're no use to us frozen, partner, so if you have any suggestions. He cocked an eyebrow, the attempted irony somewhat spoiled by his pained wince. Try to hold still, then. You won't be much use to me cooked either. A burst of heat from his hands. Vera tried not to arch her frozen body into his palms in a misguided attempt to chase the warmth. Water sizzled, vapor billowing around them in a milky cloud. I don't suppose you can just dry the armor? The Dunmer shook his head. Not enough magic left for that. Another burst of heat. She groaned in relief as he peeled off the rest of her waterlogged leathers. The cold night air hit the soggy fabric of her undergarments, and she shivered, the tremor settling in once again. Campfire? She almost bit her tongue, trying to get the word out. I'd recommend against it. Vera growled a monosyllabic curse and hugged her knees to her chest. Yes, he runs hot. Not a good reason to crawl into his lap. Get yourself together, you dumbass. Is any of our equipment dry? What's left of it is soaked through and through, I'm afraid. What do you mean? What's left of it? Sarah shrugged. Vera noticed that he had shed his armor, and the colorless linen shirt he wore looked dry. He didn't seem to suffer from the cold either. When you fell overboard, it seemed wiser to retrieve you. I sent the boat to shore as best I could by jamming the rudder. I hadn't anticipated the rocks, however. Vera tightened her arms around herself. I don't suppose you found a bow floating around, did you? This time, there was nothing ambiguous about her feeling of loss. Your weapon is by the remaining bedroll. No idea what happened to your quiver. The pack sank to the bottom, I suspect. It might be possible to recover some of our things if we wait for daylight, so I'm guessing there's no dry clothes. This was going to be a problem. Without a fire, and with the heat loss, she was unlikely to make it to sunrise. She was still clear-headed, relatively speaking, but her body felt heavy, every movement a conscious effort. You could always try that forsworn armor. I'm sure Unnar would be delighted once he wakes up. Please don't tell me that thing survived. Vera tried to discern the Dunmer's expression. Judging by the little smirk, Demon Chops was pulling her leg. She bit her tongue, smothering the impulse to tell him off, but her glare must have been sufficiently irate, because he offered a slightly contrite look and motioned for her to wait. His gaze turned inward, his face pinching in concentration. A faint, bluish glow, tinged with orange at the periphery, rose around him in a rapid swirl. He inhaled through his teeth. A sharp intake that drew both air and magic, Vera guessed, and all that remained was the faint shimmer of hot air.